In 1893, while nearly 27 million people flocked to Chicago for the World's Columbian Exposition, one of the most prolific killers in American history was renting rooms just 3 miles from the fairgrounds in a building he had personally designed with secret passages, gas lines routed into sealed chambers, and a basement he used to dispose of bodies. His name was H. H. Holmes. Newspapers would later dub his building the Murder Castle. And for over a century, the story of what happened inside it has been told and retold, often with considerably more embellishment than the actual historical record supports. Here's what H. Holmes actually did, what's documented fact, and what turned out to be exaggeration. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, to a strict disciplinarian household, and by most later biographical accounts showed early signs of manipulative, deceptive behavior well before he ever became a killer, reportedly running early insurance fraud schemes as a young man involving cadavers obtained through his medical school connections, taking out life insurance policies on the bodies, and staging fraudulent deaths to collect payouts. He attended the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, graduating in 1884, giving him genuine anatomical and medical knowledge that would later factor directly into both his killings and his additional criminal enterprises. In 1885, he abandoned his wife and young child, moved to Illinois, and adopted the name Henry Howard Holmes, reportedly chosen in part as a reference to the recently popularized fictional detective Sherlock Holmes, beginning a new identity in Chicago that gave him a clean slate to build the elaborate criminal operation he would run for most of the following decade. Holmes found initial legitimate work at a Chicago pharmacy owned by Elizabeth Holton, and after the pharmacy's original owner died under circumstances that were never fully investigated at the time, Holmes purchased the business from his widow, a transaction some later researchers have flagged as suspicious given the pattern of conveniently timed deaths that would come to define much of Holmes's later career. Using profits and credits built from the pharmacy, Holmes purchased an empty lot across the street in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood in 1887 and began construction on a large, 3-story mixed-use building, which would eventually include retail shops on the ground floor and a maze of small rooms and apartments above, a building Holmes deliberately and repeatedly changed contractors on during construction, according to later investigation, specifically so that no single worker would understand the complete layout of the structure he was building. A detail that itself, regardless of what was later exaggerated about the building's specific features, is well documented and speaks to just how methodically Holmes was already planning to conceal whatever he intended to do inside it. The building, completed in time for the 1893 World's Fair, which brought an enormous influx of visitors and prospective long-term boarders to Chicago that year, functioned publicly as a combination of retail storefronts, rental apartments, and, according to Holmes's own advertising, affordable lodging aimed specifically at young single women arriving in the city looking for work or lodging during the fair. Holmes required employees and tenants, particularly the young women who worked for him or rented rooms in the building, to take out life insurance policies naming him as the beneficiary, under the pretense that this was a standard condition of employment or tenancy, giving him a direct financial incentive layered on top of whatever other motives drove his killings. Investigators who examined the building after Holmes's eventual arrest documented genuine architectural features supporting deliberate, premeditated concealment. A room that could be sealed and filled with gas piped in from an adjustable valve Holmes controlled from his own private office. A chute connecting upper floors directly to the basement, and a basement outfitted with a large kiln-like furnace investigators believed had been used to destroy remains, along with acid vats and a stretching rack investigators speculated may have been used to prepare skeletal remains for sale to medical schools, a genuinely lucrative secondary criminal enterprise for Holmes given his own medical training and connections. The pursuit of Holmes across state lines, once investigators finally connected him to the Pytel killings, was itself carried out largely by a single dogged Philadelphia police detective named Frank Geyer, whose methodical, months-long investigation has since become almost as celebrated among historians of the case as Holmes's crimes themselves. Assigned to track down the three missing Pytesel children after their father's staged death was exposed as murder, Geyer spent the summer of 1895 following a trail of rented houses and false names across multiple states, from Indianapolis to Detroit to Toronto, painstakingly cross-referencing hotel and rental registries against the aliases investigators already knew Holmes used, working with almost nothing beyond persistence, correspondence records, and an unusually thorough understanding of how Holmes thought. Geyer's search ultimately led him to a rented house in Toronto, where, digging in the cellar based on a tip from a suspicious neighbor who recalled Holmes borrowing a spade, he personally discovered the buried remains of the two Pytel daughters, Alice and Nellie, and shortly after located the body of their younger brother Howard in a rented property in Indianapolis. Geyer's investigation, conducted using nothing resembling modern forensic technology, essentially relying on shoe leather, patience, and careful record-keeping, remains a genuinely significant case study in the history of American criminal investigation, and it was Geyer's physical recovery of the Pytel children's remains specifically that gave prosecutors the concrete, undeniable evidence needed to finally convict Holmes at all, since so much of his earlier suspected activity at the Englewood building had left no comparable physical evidence behind. Before turning to the fraud scheme that eventually exposed him, it's worth naming some of the individuals investigators came to believe were among Holmes's earlier victims at the Englewood building itself, both because they deserve to be remembered as real people rather than an anonymous body count, and because their cases illustrate exactly how Holmes operated. Julia Connor had worked for Holmes as a bookkeeper at his pharmacy, reportedly beginning an affair with him before she and her young daughter Pearl disappeared in late 1891, with investigators later concluding both were murdered inside the building, though neither body was ever definitively recovered. Emmeline Sigrand, a stenographer Holmes hired to work for him in 1892, described by acquaintances at the time as bright and well-liked, vanished later that same year, under circumstances investigators similarly connected to Holmes, again without a recovered body. Minnie Williams and her sister Anna, known to family as Nanny, were two sisters from a wealthy family whom Holmes courted and manipulated into transferring property and assets to him, before both disappeared in 1893. Their remains likewise never conclusively found. The pattern across all of these cases, young women drawn into Holmes's orbit through employment, romantic involvement, or financial dealings, followed by disappearance and an absence of any recovered remains, is precisely why the true number of people Holmes killed has always remained genuinely uncertain, since the building's furnace and acid vats, whatever their exact scale relative to later exaggeration, were entirely capable of destroying human remains completely enough that formal legal proof of murder, as opposed to strong circumstantial suspicion, was often simply impossible to establish using the forensic tools available in the 1890s. Holmes's downfall ultimately came not from the murders directly, but from an unrelated insurance fraud scheme that unraveled and drew serious criminal investigation. In 1894, Holmes was arrested in connection with a horse swindling scheme in Texas, and while imprisoned briefly on that unrelated charge, made the acquaintance of a fellow inmate named Marion Hedgepeth, to whom Holmes reportedly confided a life insurance fraud scheme he was planning involving an NP associate named Benjamin Pyteler, promising Hedgepeth a cut of the proceeds in exchange for a referral to a corrupt lawyer who could help process the claim. Holmes went on to actually murder Pyteler in September 1894, staging the death to look like an accidental laboratory explosion in order to collect a $10,000 life insurance payout, a substantial sum at the time. When Hedgepeth, having never received his promised cut, tipped off authorities out of anger at being cut out of the deal, it triggered an investigation that ultimately led detectives directly to Holmes, and from Pytel's murder, investigators traced Holmes's movements and uncovered that he had also murdered three of Pytel's own children during the following months, using the family's trust in him as their father's supposed business partner to isolate and kill each child individually while transporting them across state lines under false pretenses to their own mother, who believed Holmes was helping reunite the family. Once in custody, the scale of Holmes's broader activity at the Englewood building came under serious scrutiny for the first time, And it's here that the historical record and the popular legend genuinely begin to diverge in important ways worth being clear about. Holmes ultimately confessed to 27 murders in a widely publicized statement given before his execution, though he later recanted portions of that confession, and several of the specific people he claimed to have killed were later found to still be alive, undermining the reliability of his own account considerably. Modern historians and researchers who have gone back through the original case files, insurance records, missing persons reports and property records connected to Holmes have generally concluded that his confirmed well-documented victim count is considerably lower than the sensationalized figures that later circulated in popular culture, with most serious historians settling on somewhere around 9 victims that can be documented with real confidence. Pytel and his 3 children among them, while acknowledging the true number could plausibly be somewhat higher given how many people passed through the building as employees or tenants during Holmes's years running it, and how difficult verifying disappearances from that era, before consistent nationwide missing persons record-keeping existed, genuinely is more than a century later. It's specifically the building's reputation, the so-called murder castle itself, where the gap between documented fact and popular legend is widest, and it's worth walking through why that gap exists. Once Holmes was arrested and the scale of his crimes began making national headlines, Chicago newspapers, operating in the height of the sensationalized yellow journalism era of American print media, began publishing increasingly elaborate, largely uncorroborated descriptions of the building's supposed features: hidden trapdoors dropping victims directly into the basement, sealed asphyxiation chambers activated remotely from Holmes's office, dozens of secret passages winding through every floor, claims that made for gripping newspaper copy, but that later architectural investigators and historians examining surviving building plans and photographs have found little solid physical evidence to support in anything close to the scale the papers described. Some structural oddities documented at the time: the sealed gas-lined room, the chute to the basement, the unusually maze-like floor layout with several windowless interior rooms, were genuinely real and genuinely consistent with a building designed to facilitate concealment and control over people inside it. But many of the building's most famous, most frequently repeated features in later books, documentaries and popular retellings of the case, extensive networks of secret tunnels, elaborate mechanical torture devices, and a building whose entire footprint was supposedly honeycombed with hidden rooms, trace back not to the original 1894 and 1895 police investigation of the property, but to embellished newspaper accounts published in the following years, embellishments that were then repeated and further exaggerated across decades of popular books and documentaries until they became, in the public imagination, largely indistinguishable from the documented original investigation itself. Holmes was tried specifically for the murder of Benjamin Pytel, the case with the clearest, most directly provable evidence trail, rather than for the broader pattern of killings connected to the Englewood building, a legal strategy prosecutors pursued because it offered the strongest, most straightforward path to conviction, given the forensic and investigative limitations of the era. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, and was executed by hanging on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, in a detail that has itself become a recurring feature of retellings of the case. Holmes reportedly requested that his own coffin be filled with cement and buried 10 feet deep, out of a stated fear that grave robbers might attempt to steal or dissect his body after death. A request that was ultimately honored, and modern excavation and forensic examination of his remains conducted in 2017, undertaken specifically to settle persistent conspiracy theories that Holmes had somehow bribed his way out of his own execution and faked his death, confirmed through dental record comparison that the remains buried in that reinforced grave were, in fact, genuinely his. The 2017 exhumation, carried out at the request of some of Holmes's own descendants, who had grown curious about the persistent escape rumours circulating in popular retellings of the case for generations, involved a forensic anthropology team from the University of Pennsylvania, carefully excavating the grave, extracting a viable DNA and dental sample from the remains, which had been unusually well preserved specifically because of the reinforced cement casing Holmes himself had requested. and comparing that sample against known living relatives, ultimately confirming a genetic match consistent with the remains being Holmes's own. The findings were widely reported at the time as putting to rest one of the case's longer-running conspiracy theories, though in a pattern that will likely sound familiar by now, given how much of Holmes's broader legend has proven resistant to correction. Some corners of true crime media and internet discussion continued circulating the escape theory anyway in the years since, treating a scientifically confirmed forensic match with the same casual skepticism that's been applied to virtually every other documented fact in this case since the newspapers first got hold of it in 1895. Holmes's case also holds a genuinely significant, if grim, place in the broader history of American criminal justice and insurance regulation, well beyond its value as a sensational newspaper story. The scale and sophistication of his insurance fraud schemes, murdering people specifically to collect payouts on policies he'd arranged with or without the victim's full awareness, contributed directly to tightening industry practices around life insurance underwriting and beneficiary verification. In the years that followed, part of a broader wave of reform the American insurance industry underwent around the turn of the 20th century, partly in direct response to cases like his. Legal historians have also pointed to the Holmes trial and the extensive Pitzel investigation as an early formative example of what would later become standard, multi-jurisdictional homicide investigation practice in the United States, detectives from different cities and states coordinating evidence, records, and travel to build a single prosecutable case against a suspect who had deliberately used interstate movement and aliases specifically to evade exactly that kind of coordinated pursuit, a challenge that pushed period law enforcement toward practices that would become considerably more standardized in the decades afterward. The Englewood building itself survived for decades after Holmes's execution, functioning at various points as ordinary retail and residential space before being destroyed by a fire of suspicious, never fully determined origin in August 1938, and the site was ultimately demolished entirely, with a United States Post Office branch built on the property, which still stands there today. No physical trace of the original structure remains, meaning that virtually everything modern audiences know about the building's interior layout comes exclusively from a combination of the original, comparatively modest 1894 police investigation notes and more than a century of accumulated, increasingly embellished retelling built on top of that original, considerably less dramatic foundation. HHA. Holmes remains a genuine, well-documented American serial killer. One of the earliest cases in the country's history to be extensively covered as a media sensation in something close to the modern true crime sense, and separating what he actually, provably did, using his medical training, his insurance fraud schemes, and a building genuinely designed with concealment in mind, from what more than a century of sensationalized retelling has since added to his legend, remains one of the more genuinely useful exercises in the entire true crime genre for understanding how quickly a documented crime can calcify into a considerably more exaggerated myth. Much of the modern renewed interest in the case traces directly back to author Erik Larson's 2003 non-fiction book, The Devil in the White City, which interweaves the story of Holmes's murders with the parallel story of the 1893 World's Fair's construction and its chief architect, Daniel Burnham, drawing a deliberate, atmospheric contrast between the fair's celebrated architectural achievement and the killer quietly operating in its shadow just a few miles away. The book became an enormous bestseller and reintroduced Holmes's story to a massive contemporary audience, largely unfamiliar with the original 1890s case. And Larson has been reasonably careful, by the standards of popular narrative non-fiction, to ground his account in verifiable historical sources. The book's enormous popularity has also, somewhat ironically, contributed to further blurring the line between documented fact and dramatized narrative flourish in the public's understanding of the case, simply because it's now the primary lens through which most people encounter the story at all. A long-in-development film adaptation of the book, at various points attached to major Hollywood directors and stars over nearly 2 decades, has never actually been completed or released, itself becoming something of a minor Hollywood legend in its own right, though the book's massive sales and continued cultural presence have ensured Holmes's story remains a fixture of American true crime media, regardless of whether that particular adaptation ever reaches theaters. More than a century after his execution, H.H. Holmes occupies a genuinely unusual position in American criminal history. A killer whose actual documented crimes were serious and disturbing enough on their own merits to warrant the enduring fascination, and yet whose popular legend has been so thoroughly inflated by more than 100 years of newspaper sensationalism, embellished retelling, and modern dramatization that the real verifiable historical record and the version most people actually know now sit meaningfully far apart. Frank Geyer's investigation, the Pytezel children's recovered remains, and the roughly 9 documented victims connected to Holmes with genuine historical confidence are more than sufficient, on their own, to justify his place as one of the more disturbing and consequential criminal cases in our 19th century America. He never needed the extra floors of secret rooms and mechanical torture devices that later newspapers invented for him. The real story, stripped back down to what investigators could actually prove, was already more than horrifying enough. Modern criminal psychology and criminology have periodically revisited Holmes specifically as an unusually early, unusually well-documented case study in what later researchers would come to classify as organized offender behavior, a category of serial killer characterized by careful planning, situational control, and a genuine capacity to maintain an outwardly normal, functional public life alongside sustained, methodical predatory behavior over an extended period. Holmes fit that later developed criminological framework with an eerie precision decades before the framework itself existed, running a legitimate pharmacy business, maintaining an active, and, by most contemporary accounts, genuinely charming social presence in his Chicago neighborhood, successfully courting and, in several cases, formally or informally marrying multiple women simultaneously under different identities, without any of them apparently discovering the other's existence for years, all while operating an increasingly sophisticated pattern of insurance fraud and murder running quietly, alongside his public respectability. Later researchers examining the case have specifically noted how effectively Holmes weaponized period social expectations to his advantage, particularly around the treatment of unmarried, financially independent young women, whose disappearances, in an era before consistent nationwide missing persons tracking, family estrangement records, or basic background check infrastructure existed, could pass with relatively little sustained institutional scrutiny compared to how a similar pattern of disappearances would almost certainly be flagged and cross-referenced today, a genuinely important piece of period social context for understanding how Holmes was able to operate for as long as he did, before Hedgepeth's tip inside a Texas jail cell finally exposed him. The insurance industry connection specifically deserves a bit more attention because it wasn't a minor side detail to Holmes's operation, it was arguably the actual engine driving much of it. Holmes had a documented, sophisticated understanding of how life insurance underwriting worked in the 1880s and 1890s, an era when policies could often be taken out with considerably less verification of the insured party's identity, health, and circumstances than would become standard practice in later decades, partly in direct response to fraud cases like his own. He is believed to have run multiple parallel insurance fraud schemes simultaneously, some involving cadavers obtained through his own medical school connections and staged as accidental deaths of policyholders who, in reality, never existed or had already died of natural causes years earlier, and others involving real people whose deaths he then arranged to collect on policies he'd specifically encouraged them to purchase, often naming himself as a business associate entitled to a share of the payout. Investigators piecing together his financial records after his arrest found a genuinely extensive paper trail of insurance applications, policy transfers, and claims filed under multiple aliases, evidence that painted a portrait of someone treating murder, at least in part, as one component of a broader, calculated financial operation rather than purely an expression of uncontrolled compulsion, a characterization that has made Holmes a particularly unsettling case study for researchers specifically because it suggests a killer whose violence was, to whatever degree, genuinely instrumental and profit-driven rather than purely psychologically compulsive, a distinction criminologists consider meaningfully important when trying to understand what actually motivated him. Holmes's own final words and demeanor at his execution have themselves become a small, frequently repeated detail within the broader legend. Worth noting specifically because contemporary newspaper accounts of his hanging described him as remarkably calm and composed right up until the end, reportedly even assisting the executioner with technical adjustments to the mechanism himself, a level of cold, methodical composure in his final moments that period reporters found genuinely unsettling, and that later writers have frequently cited as a fitting, if grim, final illustration of the same controlled, calculating temperament that had allowed him to operate for so long beforehand. In March 1919, a letter arrived at a New Orleans newspaper office claiming to be from a killer who had already murdered several people across the city with an axe, stolen from each victim's own home. The letter announced a specific night the killer intended to strike again, and offered a strange, oddly specific exemption. Anyone playing jazz music in their home at the appointed hour would be spared. That night, dance halls across New Orleans filled beyond capacity. Amateur musicians who'd never performed publicly in their lives played for hours in their own front rooms, and by sunrise, not a single person in the city had been attacked. Whether the letter actually came from the killer or from an opportunist capitalizing on a citywide panic has never been established. Neither has the killer's identity. This is the real story of the Axeman of New Orleans, one of the strangest, most genuinely under-examined, unsolved serial murder cases in American history. The attacks attributed to the Axeman took place across a period of roughly 18 months, beginning in May 1918 and continuing intermittently through October 1919, though determining exactly how many attacks belong to a single perpetrator as opposed to unrelated crimes later folded into the same. Sensationalized narrative by contemporary newspapers remains one of the case's most genuine ongoing points of historical disagreement. Accounts from the period and modern historical analysis both describe a consistent pattern across the most credibly connected attacks. The killer targeted mostly Italian immigrant grocers and their families, entering homes at night, typically by chiseling through a door panel rather than forcing a lock, and using an axe or hatchet found on the premises itself rather than bringing a weapon to the scene. A detail investigators found genuinely significant at the time, since it suggested either extreme confidence, familiarity with the layout of similar homes, or possibly both. Victims were attacked while sleeping, and the assailant, in every documented case, escaped without leaving behind fingerprints, a clear physical description beyond vague general details, or any weapon traceable back to a specific purchase or owner. At least 6 people were killed across the attacks most consistently attributed to the Axeman, with several more surviving serious injuries, though total counts across different books and articles covering the case vary considerably depending on which individual incidents a given researcher chooses to include as genuinely connected versus coincidental or copycat violence occurring in the same general period. The attacks began drawing serious, sustained public attention in the summer of 1918, when a pattern targeting Italian grocery store owners specifically became difficult for the New Orleans press and police department to ignore. Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were among the earliest widely reported victims, attacked in their home behind their grocery store in the early hours of May 23, 1918, both killed with an axe left behind at the scene, one belonging to the family itself. Investigators found a chiseled panel removed from the back door, the method that would become the killer's signature across the following attacks, along with a straight razor, also apparently the family's own, left at the scene, adding a strange, deliberate quality to the crime scene that unsettled investigators from the very beginning. Similar attacks followed over the following months, targeting other Italian grocers and their families in comparable circumstances. Chiseled door panels, weapons taken from inside the home, no forced entry evidence beyond the door itself, and no items reported stolen, ruling out robbery as an obvious motive and deepening the sense among both investigators and an increasingly anxious public that the attacks were being carried out by someone with a specific, if entirely unexplained, pattern of victim selection. The specifically Italian character of the victim pattern led early investigators and much of the contemporary press coverage toward theories connecting the attacks to organized crime, specifically the Black Hand, a loosely organized extortion network operating within some Italian immigrant communities in several American cities during this period, using threats and violence to extract payments from immigrant business owners. New Orleans police pursued this angle seriously for a period, given the city's own documented history with Italian organized crime violence, including the unresolved 1890 assassination of Police Superintendent David Hennessy, a killing that had already generated significant anti-Italian sentiment, and mob violence in the city decades before the Axeman attacks began. That existing tension shaped public and press reaction throughout the Axeman case considerably, with some contemporary coverage explicitly and unfairly treating the attacks as confirmation of pre-existing prejudices against the city's Italian immigrant community, rather than engaging with the attacks as a mystery genuinely lacking a clear evidence-based motive. Investigators were never able to establish a credible, evidence-backed connection between the attacks and organized extortion activity specifically, and the theory has been treated with considerable skepticism by most modern historians examining the case, in part because genuine Black Hand extortion violence typically followed a very different pattern, targeted specifically at business owners who would refuse payment demands, which doesn't match the more indiscriminate, seemingly opportunistic selection of victims across the actual Axeman attacks. One specific attack, and the deeply flawed investigation that followed it, stands out from the broader pattern as one of the case's most genuinely troubling chapters, precisely because it produced a real, documented miscarriage of justice against people who almost certainly had nothing to do with the killings at all. In the early hours of March 9, 1919, grocer Charlie Cortimiglia was asleep with his wife Rosie and their 2-year-old daughter Mary when an intruder broke in and attacked all three with an axe. Mary was killed. Both her parents survived the attack with severe head injuries, though Rosie's recovery was slow and difficult. While she was still hospitalized and in a fragile, traumatized state, investigators repeatedly pressed her about whether the family's neighbors, fellow Italian grocers Orlando Giordano and his teenage son Frank, might have been responsible, despite the family having no documented history of conflict with the Giordanos and no physical evidence connecting either man to the attack. According to the physician treating her at the time, Rosie consistently told hospital staff she genuinely did not recognize her attacker. Authorities nonetheless arrested her as a material witness once she was well enough to leave the hospital and held her in custody until she ultimately signed a statement implicating the Giordanos, a statement her own defenders and later researchers examining the case have characterized as effectively coerced, extracted from a grieving, traumatized, and by that point incarcerated mother rather than freely given. On the strength of that statement, both Giordanos were convicted, Orlando Giordano sentenced to life in prison, and his son Frank sentenced to death. They spent more than a year wrongfully incarcerated before Rosie Cortimiglia, reportedly overwhelmed with guilt over what her testimony had done to two innocent men, walked into the Times-Picayune's offices in December 1920 and publicly recanted her identification, stating she had never actually recognized her attacker at all. The Louisiana Supreme Court ultimately overturned the convictions, and both father and son were released. Though the year and a half they'd already spent wrongfully imprisoned, one of them under sentence of death, was never undone, and no one else was ever successfully prosecuted for the attack that killed young Mary Cortimiglia. It's a case that stands as a genuine, documented example of exactly the kind of investigative and prosecutorial failure that widespread public panic, combined with pre-existing prejudice against the city's Italian immigrant community, can produce, entirely independent of whatever the real truth behind the broader Axeman attacks actually was. The case reached its strangest, most enduring cultural moment in March 1919, when the Times-Picayune newspaper published a letter purportedly written by the killer, addressed generally to the people of New Orleans. The letter, written in a theatrical, almost gleefully taunting tone, claimed the author was not a human being at all, but rather a supernatural entity, a demon from what the letter called the hottest hell, mocking the city's police department for its inability to catch him and promising to strike again on the night of March 19th, 1919, specifically during what the letter described as the exact hour of midnight. The letter's most famous line offered the killer's strange bargain directly. Anyone with a jazz band playing in their home at that hour, the letter claimed, would be spared from attack, out of the author's stated personal fondness for the music. Whether this letter was genuinely written by whoever was carrying out the attacks, or was an opportunistic hoax written by someone else entirely capitalizing on the citywide panic already surrounding the case, has never been resolved, and it's worth being direct that no solid evidence has ever definitively connected the letter's author to the actual physical attacks themselves, a distinction popular retellings of the case frequently blur or skip past entirely in favor of the letter's considerably more entertaining, quotable content. Whatever its true authorship, the letter's impact on the city was immediate and genuinely remarkable. On the night of March 19th, New Orleans effectively became one enormous, citywide jazz performance. Dance halls and cabarets packed far beyond their normal capacity. Restaurants and private homes across the city filled with live music played by professional bands, amateur musicians, and, according to some contemporary newspaper accounts, residents who had never previously performed music publicly at all, simply banging out simple tunes on pianos or improvising with whatever instruments they had access to, specifically to ensure their household would qualify for the letter's stated exemption. It's worth understanding why the jazz exemption specifically landed with such force in New Orleans, of all American cities, since the letter's demand would have carried a very different weight almost anywhere else in the country at the time. New Orleans in 1919 was, by a wide margin, the epicenter of the still-emerging jazz genre, a musical form that had developed directly out of the city's uniquely layered African-American, Creole, and immigrant musical traditions over the preceding 2 decades, and was, by 1919, spreading outward to the rest of the country largely through New Orleans musicians who were beginning to travel and record. Jazz at that point was still a genuinely local, still somewhat disreputable art form in the eyes of much of respectable society, closely associated with the city's saloons, dance halls, and red light districts rather than the concert hall respectability it would gain in later decades, which makes the letter's specific request that citizens embrace jazz publicly and enthusiastically as literal protection from a murderer land as an almost perfectly tailored piece of local psychological theater. Whoever actually wrote it, asking the entire city of New Orleans specifically to fill its homes with live jazz on a single appointed night, wasn't a generic threat dressed up with an arbitrary condition. It was a demand that plugged directly into the single most locally significant, most rapidly spreading cultural phenomenon the city had, which is a large part of why the letter generated such an immediate, overwhelming, citywide response rather than being dismissed as an obvious hoax. Sheet music publishers in the following weeks capitalized directly on the frenzy, releasing a novelty song titled The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, subtitled Don't Scare Me Papa, marketed explicitly around the case, an early, genuinely striking example of true crime entertainment merchandising built around an active, unsolved case while the public panic surrounding it was still ongoing. No attacks were reported the specific night, a fact that has been read 2 very different ways ever since. Either as evidence the jazz exemption letter really did come from the killer and the city's citywide compliance genuinely worked, or, considerably more mundanely, as evidence that a citywide compliance genuinely worked, or, considerably more mundanely, as evidence that a citywide public panic and a dramatically increased police and civilian presence out on the streets that night simply made conditions unfavorable for any attacker, real letter writer or not, to safely strike. The attacks continued sporadically after that widely publicized night, with several more incidents reported through the following months, before the pattern of attacks attributed to the Axeman appears to have stopped entirely by late October 1919, without any arrest, confession, or conclusive identification of a suspect ever following. One later development has become a significant, if still ultimately unproven, part of the case's mythology. In December 1920, A man named Joseph Mumfre was shot and killed in Los Angeles by a woman named Esther Albano, the widow of one of the Axeman's earlier victims, Mike Pepitone, who had been killed in an attack in October 1919, matching the established pattern. Albano claimed she recognized Mumfre on a Los Angeles street as her husband's killer and shot him in what she described as an act of revenge. And some later researchers examining the case have pointed to circumstantial evidence, including Mumfre's documented movements and a criminal record involving prior violence, as potentially connecting him to at least some of the Axeman attacks. Mumfre was never formally charged or convicted in connection with any of the New Orleans killings. However, since he was already dead by the time serious investigative attention turned toward him, and the theory connecting him definitively to the broader pattern of attacks remained speculative rather than conclusively established, resting largely on circumstantial timeline alignment and a grieving widow's identification made under considerably fraught emotional circumstances, rather than any physical evidence directly tying him to the New Orleans crime scenes themselves. Modern researchers who've dug most deeply into the case, including historian Miriam C. Davis, whose 2017 book specifically re-examined the surviving police records, newspaper archives, and court documents connected to the attacks, have generally treated the Mumfre theory with real interest but genuine caution, noting that while the timeline of his known movements does align suggestively with gaps and resumptions in the pattern of attacks, and while his documented criminal history does establish a real capacity for violence, none of that constitutes the kind of direct physical or testimonial evidence that would allow a modern historian to treat the case as definitively solved. It's also worth noting explicitly that the Axeman attacks are generally treated by researchers as a distinct case from a separate, broader theory. Some true crime researchers and authors have proposed connecting a wider pattern of unsolved axe murders of entire sleeping families across small American towns in the years roughly between 1890 and 1912, a theory built around the idea of a single itinerant killer traveling by rail between towns. That earlier theorized pattern is generally treated as ending before the New Orleans attacks even began in 1918, and most researchers examining both cases separately have not found compelling evidence directly linking the two, treating the Axeman of New Orleans as its own distinct, self-contained, unsolved case rather than a later chapter of that earlier proposed pattern, however superficially similar an axe-wielding, family-targeting killer in each story might sound at first glance. The New Orleans press's handling of the case throughout 1918 and 1919 also deserves scrutiny in its own right, since sensationalized, often inconsistent contemporary newspaper coverage is a large part of why modern researchers still disagree about exactly how many attacks genuinely belong to a single perpetrator. Competing New Orleans papers, racing to outdo each other on a story that was reliably selling copies across the entire region, frequently attributed additional, only loosely similar attacks and unrelated domestic violence cases to the Axeman in the moment, generating a far larger, messier body of Axeman crimes in the immediate contemporary record that most careful modern historians are willing to treat as genuinely connected. Some later attacks that made contemporary headlines under the Axeman name are now generally regarded by researchers as likely unrelated crimes, opportunistically folded into the ongoing citywide panic narrative because doing so guaranteed front-page placement, a pattern of media behavior that will likely sound familiar to anyone who has followed how modern true crime cases sometimes get inflated or distorted by competing outlets chasing the same audience. Untangling the genuinely connected core group of attacks, generally understood to include the Maggio, Cortimiglia, and Pepitone families among others, from this larger contemporary body of loosely attributed violence, remains one of the case's persistent, unglamorous research challenges. And it's a significant part of why even the most careful modern books on the subject present their victim counts as reasoned historical judgment calls rather than settled fact. Roughly a century on, the Axeman of New Orleans occupies a genuinely unusual place among America's unsolved serial murder cases, distinguished less by the scale of the violence itself, which, however tragic for the specific families involved, was smaller in documented scope than several other unsolved cases from the same general era, and more by the sheer, almost theatrical strangeness of the jazz letter and the citywide response it produced. No other unsolved American serial murder case from this period produced anything resembling an entire city playing music in its own defense on a single appointed night. And that detail alone has ensured the case remains a fixture of true crime retellings, podcasts, and documentaries more than 100 years later, even though the actual underlying mystery, who killed at least 6 people across 18 months of chiseled door panels and stolen household axes, and why Italian grocers specifically, remains every bit as unresolved today as it was when the last reported attack occurred in October 1919. The letter got a city to play music through the night out of genuine fear. The killer, whoever they actually were, got exactly what the earlier newspaper accounts had already started giving them before the letter was ever written: a permanent place in the city's folklore and a case file that's never once, in over a century, been closed. It's also worth situating the case within the specific, difficult social context of Italian immigrant life in early 20th century New Orleans, since the attacks didn't happen in a social vacuum, and understanding that context helps explain both the pattern of the attacks themselves and the community's own response to them. Italian immigrants, and Sicilian immigrants in particular, made up a substantial and rapidly growing portion of New Orleans' population by the 1910s, frequently working in trades like grocery ownership that gave the broader community regular, visible economic presence throughout the city's neighborhoods, while also facing sustained discrimination, suspicion, and periodic mob violence dating back decades, including the 1891 lynching of 11 Italian immigrants following the unresolved Hennessy assassination, one of the largest mass lynchings in American history, and a genuinely dark chapter in the city's own past that directly shaped how both the Italian community and the wider public interpreted a new wave of violence specifically targeting Italian grocers roughly 3 decades later. Some historians examining the Axman case have argued that this pre-existing climate of suspicion and vulnerability may have made the Italian immigrant community specifically hesitant to fully trust or cooperate with local law enforcement during the investigation, given the community's own recent, direct historical experience of law enforcement and mob violence directed against them rather than in their defense. A dynamic that, if accurate, would have represented one more compounding obstacle layered on top of an already difficult, evidence-poor investigation. The New Orleans Police Department's own investigative approach during the active period of the attacks also drew significant contemporary and later criticism, worth understanding as its own distinct factor, separate from the broader questions of press sensationalism and community mistrust. Officers investigating the case reportedly lacked any centralized, coordinated task force specifically dedicated to the pattern of attacks for a considerable stretch of the investigation, with individual precincts and detectives often working the various incidents in comparative isolation from one another before the pattern was formally recognized as connected, a structural investigative weakness that later analysts examining the case have argued likely allowed valuable early opportunities for cross-referencing witness statements, timeline details, and physical evidence across the different attack sites to be lost. The department also reportedly offered, then rescinded or complicated, various reward amounts for information leading to an arrest over the course of the investigation, generating public confusion and, according to some contemporary newspaper criticism, a degree of public cynicism about how seriously the department was actually prioritizing the case relative to the sustained fear it was generating throughout the city. Whether a more coordinated, centralized investigative approach from the outset would have ultimately identified the killer remains, like nearly everything else about this case, impossible to know for certain more than a century later, but it stands as one more documented systemic factor layered on top of the case's fundamental evidentiary thinness, helping explain why an investigation that consumed enormous public attention and genuine police resources over an 18-month span ultimately produced no conviction at all. Between December 1968 and October 1969, an unidentified killer attacked 5 confirmed pairs of victims across Northern California, then spent the following years writing taunting letters to newspapers claiming a considerably higher body count and daring police to catch him using a name he invented himself. He called himself the Zodiac. more than half a century later, despite modern DNA testing, genetic genealogy techniques that have cracked dozens of other cold cases, and one of the largest amateur investigation communities ever built around a single unsolved crime, the Zodiac Killer's true identity has never been officially confirmed. This is what's actually documented about one of America's most famous unsolved serial murder cases, and why, despite endless claimed breakthroughs over the decades, it remains formally open today. The first attack officially attributed to the Zodiac occurred on December 20th, 1968, when 17-year-old Betty Lou Jensen and 16-year-old David Faraday were shot and killed while parked on a rural road outside Vallejo, California, on what appears to have been one of their first dates. Investigators found no clear motive, no robbery, and initially treated it as an isolated, unsolved double homicide. On July 4, 1969, a similar attack occurred at a different Vallejo lookout point. Darlene Ferrin, 22, was shot and killed, and her companion Michael Maggio survived being shot multiple times, later providing police with a general description of the attacker. Roughly half an hour after that second attack, a man called the Vallejo Police Department, calmly reporting the shootings and directing officers to the location, then hung up before officers could trace the call in detail, one of several instances across the case where the killer directly, confidently inserted himself into the investigation, rather than simply fleeing and staying silent. The killer's identity as a distinct, self-aware, communicative figure crystallized fully on August 1st, 1969, when three nearly identical letters, each containing a portion of an encoded cipher, arrived simultaneously at the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. Each letter claimed responsibility for the Vallejo attacks, included details about the crimes that hadn't been publicly released, and demanded the newspapers print the enclosed cipher on their front pages, threatening further killings if they refused. The papers complied. Within roughly a week, a school teacher couple in Salinas, California, Donald and Betty Harden, working independently at their kitchen table without any specialized cryptographic training, successfully solved the three-part cipher later known as Z408 for its 408 individual symbols, revealing a rambling message in which the writer described murder as more thrilling than any other human experience, and claimed victims would become his slaves in the afterlife, along with a partial signature block of unrelated symbols that has never been definitively deciphered to this day. A second, considerably longer cipher, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle on November 8, 1969, and containing 340 individual symbols, proved far more resistant to solving than the original three-part message, and would remain completely unsolved for more than 50 years, quietly becoming one of the most famous unbroken codes in American criminal history, and a genuine ongoing obsession for a global community of amateur and professional cryptographers who continued attempting to crack it decade after decade, long after the original investigation had gone cold. That changed in December 2020, when three independent code breakers working together, David Oranchak, a software developer based in the United States, Sam Blake, a mathematician working in Australia, and Jarl van Eyck, a programmer in Belgium, who had connected online specifically around their shared interest in unsolved historical ciphers, successfully determined the correct reading order and substitution pattern needed to decode the message, submitting their solution to the FBI, which confirmed it as accurate. The decoded message, once revealed, turned out to be a genuinely unsettling but relatively brief statement in which the writer expressed a lack of fear of the gas chamber specifically because, in the message's own words, killing would grant him more slaves to serve him in the afterlife, and claimed that he was not afraid because his death would come with, in the cipher's phrasing, considerably less suffering than the deaths of his victims. The FBI, in confirming the solution publicly, noted the case remained an active, ongoing investigation for its San Francisco field office, and declined to comment further, a level of continued official caution that itself underscores just how genuinely unresolved the broader case remains, even with one of its most famous individual puzzles finally solved. The attacks continued into September 1969, when a man wearing a black executioner-style hood decorated with a white cross and circle symbol, a symbol that would become permanently associated with the case, approached a young couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, picnicking near Lake Berryessa, claiming to be an escaped convict who needed their car and money. He then bound both victims and stabbed them repeatedly. Shepard died from her injuries days later. Hartnell survived and provided investigators with a detailed physical description of the attacker's costume and mannerisms, one of the case's most direct pieces of witness testimony. The killer then drove to a nearby location and, in a detail that has struck researchers as genuinely audacious even within an already audacious pattern of behavior, used a pen to write a summary of the attack, including the dates of all his prior killings, directly on the inside of Hartnell's own car door, before calling the Napa County Sheriff's Department to report the crime himself, again hanging up before the call could be fully traced. The final confirmed attack occurred on October 11, 1969, in San Francisco itself, when taxi driver Paul Stein was shot and killed by a passenger who then tore a portion of Stein's blood-stained shirt as a souvenir, an item the killer would later reference in a subsequent letter to prove authenticity. This attack occurred in a residential neighborhood with witnesses nearby, and police responding to the scene within minutes actually encountered a man matching the general description given by witnesses walking calmly in the area, but working from a garbled radio description that had incorrectly relayed the suspect's race did not detain him, a specific, well-documented investigative failure that has been examined and re-examined by researchers and journalists for decades since as one of the case's most consequential near misses. Following the Stein murder, the killer's letters to Bay Area newspapers continued for several more years, growing increasingly elaborate and taunting, at various points claiming credit for a considerably higher total body count than the 5 confirmed deaths investigators could directly connect to. Him, at one point claiming 37 victims, a figure investigators and researchers have always treated with substantial skepticism, given the complete absence of corroborating evidence for the vast majority of those claimed killings. The letters included additional ciphers, most of which remained unsolved for decades, taunted named investigators directly, referenced popular culture, including a specific unsettling threat invoking the film The Exorcist, and at points went silent for extended stretches before resuming again, an inconsistent pattern that has itself fueled decades of debate among researchers about which letters, precisely, were genuinely authored by the same person responsible for the original attacks, as opposed to opportunistic copycats capitalizing on the case's massive contemporary media coverage. Pattern of ambiguity that echoes almost exactly the kind of authentication problems that have complicated other serial murder cases from the same general era. Beyond the 5 confirmed murders and 2 survivors directly connected to the documented attacks, one additional disappearance has remained persistently, if never conclusively, linked to the case in a way that adds a genuinely unresolved thread to an already unresolved story. Donna Lass, a nurse working near Lake Tahoe, vanished in September 1970, and the later Zodiac letter appeared to make an oblique, taunting reference to a missing nurse in the same general region, a detail that led investigators at the time, and researchers ever since, to treat her disappearance as a plausible, if never definitively proven, additional Zodiac victim. The case remained a genuine open question for more than 5 decades, until a skull discovered in the Lake Tahoe area back in 1986 was finally identified through modern DNA profiling in 2023, more than 35 years after its original discovery, as belonging to Donna Lass, finally confirming her death and giving her family a resolution of sorts after more than 50 years, even though the identification did nothing to resolve whether the Zodiac killer was actually responsible, since no additional evidence beyond the ambiguous letter reference has ever definitively connected her death to the broader pattern of attacks investigators can more confidently attribute to him. Investigators pursued numerous suspects over the following decades, and it's worth being precise about their actual status, since none was ever formally charged with the Zodiac murder specifically, and the case remains by the San Francisco Police Department and FBI's own official classification, open and unsolved. The most extensively investigated suspect was Arthur Lee Allen, a Vallejo resident with a documented prior conviction for child molestation, who came to police attention in 1969 after an acquaintance reported concerning statements Allen had allegedly made referencing the killings before some details had been publicly released. Allen owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch featuring the same cross and circle symbol used in the killer's letters, possessed firearms consistent with calibers used in some of the attacks, and was tentatively identified by surviving victim Michael Maggio in a photo lineup years after the Vallejo attack, though that identification came under a photograph taken considerably later than the crime, and has been treated with real caution by researchers, given the well-documented unreliability of eyewitness identification made under those conditions. Handwriting analysis conducted at the time did not conclusively match Allen's writing to the killer's letters, and DNA testing conducted on preserved evidence in later years, after forensic DNA technology had significantly advanced beyond what was available during the original investigation, did not produce a match to Allen either, though investigators involved in that testing have also cautioned that the specific DNA sample tested was partial, degraded, and of genuinely uncertain evidentiary reliability given decades of evidence handling before modern forensic protocols existed. Allen was never charged and died in 1992, maintaining his innocence throughout the years he remained under suspicion. More recently, in 2021, a group calling itself the Case Breakers, composed of a mix of retired law enforcement officials, forensic specialists, and amateur researchers, publicly announced they had identified the Zodiac killer as a man named Gary Francis Post, a Southern California resident who died in 2018, citing a combination of circumstantial evidence including photographic comparisons, claimed matches between Post's known movements and the timeline of attacks, and analysis of scarring visible in photographs the group argued was consistent with an injury the Zodiac referenced in one of his letters. The announcement generated enormous media coverage given how long the case had gone unresolved, but it was met with immediate substantial skepticism from official law enforcement agencies still handling the case. The San Francisco Police Department and the FBI both stated publicly, within days of the announcement, that the Casebreakers' findings did not meet the evidentiary threshold needed to reopen or formally close the case, and independent researchers who have spent decades on the Zodiac case, professionally and as serious amateur investigators, pointed out significant gaps and disputed interpretations in the group's published evidence, ranging from the reliability of the photographic scar comparison to alleged timeline connections that other researchers have argued don't actually hold up under closer scrutiny. As of the most recent official statements from the agencies still nominally responsible for the case, Gary Francis Post has never been officially confirmed as the Zodiac killer, and the case remains formally open. Beyond Allen and Posty, decades of both professional and amateur investigation have produced a genuinely long list of additional named individuals proposed as the Zodiac at various points, including Richard Gajkowski, a former printing press worker whose voice some witnesses believed resembled recordings of a man who called into a television program claiming to be the killer, and Lawrence Kane, a San Francisco businessman whose handwriting some independent forensic document examiners hired by later researchers have argued shows genuine similarities to the killer's letters, an assessment other examiners have disputed. None of these individuals was ever charged, and it is worth being direct that the sheer number of named suspects proposed across more than 50 years, each with their own dedicated group of researchers convinced they found the answer, is itself one of the more telling features of the entire case. A genuinely large body of circumstantial evidence exists, spread out unevenly across several different candidates, without any single piece of direct forensic evidence, a confirmed DNA match, a fingerprint, or a definitively authenticated confession, ever emerging to conclusively settle the question. In the way DNA evidence and modern genetic genealogy techniques have successfully resolved numerous other decades-old cold cases in recent years. That gap between how successfully genetic genealogy has cracked comparable cold cases elsewhere and how completely it's failed to resolve the Zodiac case specifically deserves its own explanation, because it's not for lack of trying. Investigators have, at various points over the past decade, attempted DNA testing on preserved evidence connected to the case, including partial genetic material recovered from envelope seals and stamps used on several of the killer's letters, technically capable, in theory, of being run through the same public genealogy databases that have identified suspects in dozens of other unsolved cases nationwide. In practice, researchers involved in those efforts have described the available genetic material as frustratingly degraded, contaminated by decades of handling by investigators, lab technicians, and researchers working long before modern evidence preservation protocols existed, and, in some instances, simply insufficient in quantity to produce a genealogy database-ready profile at all. It's a genuinely unusual situation within the broader recent wave of cold case resolutions. The scientific technique that has solved case after case after case elsewhere in the country over the past several years is actively being applied to Zodiac-related evidence by researchers who want nothing more than to finally close the case, and has simply, so far, run into physical evidence too damaged by half a century of handling to produce a usable result. The case's grip on popular culture has, if anything, only deepened in the decades since the original attacks. And it's worth understanding why the Zodiac specifically has endured so much more prominently than many other unsolved serial murder cases from the same general era. Dr. David Fincher's 2007 film, Zodiac, based on journalist and cartoonist Robert Graysmith's own extensively researched, if later disputed in certain particulars, books on the case, is widely regarded as one of the more meticulously researched true crime films ever produced, recreating the original attacks and investigation in painstaking procedural detail. And the film's critical success introduced an entirely new generation of viewers to the case's central mysteries, particularly the ciphers, in a way that directly fed the modern surge of interest that would eventually produce the amateur code-breaking teams responsible for cracking Z340 more than a decade later. Graysmith's own books, while foundational to popular understanding of the case, have themselves faced sustained criticism from other researchers and journalists over the years for allegedly overstating the strength of the case against Arthur Lee Allen, specifically, a critique that adds yet another layer to the case's already considerable challenge of separating rigorously documented fact from decades of accumulated, well-intentioned, but not always fully rigorous amateur and semi-professional investigation. What's kept the case alive as an active, ongoing amateur research community, in a way relatively few other unsolved murder cases from the 1960s have managed to sustain, comes down largely to the ciphers themselves and the specific kind of intellectual, puzzle-solving engagement they invite that a purely circumstantial murder mystery generally doesn't. Online forums and research communities dedicated specifically to the Zodiac case have operated continuously for well over 2 decades at this point, with dedicated researchers cross-referencing newly digitized newspaper archives, period phone records, and declassified police documents obtained through public records requests, essentially running a decentralized, all-volunteer cold case investigation that has, on at least one occasion, the successful 2020 decoding of Z340 produced a genuine FBI-confirmed breakthrough that trained law enforcement cryptographers had failed to achieve across 5 full decades of official effort. That specific success story, 3 volunteers with day jobs in software development, mathematics and programming, succeeding where the FBI's own code-breaking resources hadn't, has itself become a significant part of why the case continues attracting new amateur researchers each year, offering a rare, genuine example of citizen investigators meaningfully advancing an active federal cold case using nothing more than publicly available material and sustained collective effort. It's worth being clear-eyed, too, about the darker side of that same sustained amateur fascination, because the Zodiac case has, over 5 decades, also become a genuine magnet for false confessions, fabricated evidence claims, and, in some documented instances, real harm done to people wrongly connected to the case in the court of public opinion long before any formal investigative process could weigh in. Numerous individuals have falsely confessed to be in the Zodiac over the decades, some seeking attention, others reportedly suffering from documented mental health conditions that led them to genuinely believe false memories of involvement. each new confession requiring investigators to expend real time and resources ruling them out using whatever forensic and testimonial evidence remained available. Family members of several named suspects, including relatives of Arthur Lee Allen, have spoken publicly in subsequent years about the genuine, lasting toll that decades of public suspicion, tabloid coverage, and amateur internet investigation directed at their relative took on their own lives, regardless of whether that specific suspect was ever actually guilty. A pattern that echoes uncomfortably across several of the other most famous unsolved cases in American true crime, where the family members of investigated but never charged suspects often end up absorbing a considerable unwanted share of public scrutiny that a formal legal process, whatever its own limitations, is at least designed to eventually resolve one way or the other. The surviving victims of the confirmed attacks, Michael Maggio and Brian Hartnell specifically, have themselves lived the remainder of their lives with a genuinely unusual relationship to an ongoing, unresolved national mystery periodically sought out by journalists, documentary crews, and researchers for fresh interviews decades after their attacks. Each new round of media attention requiring them to revisit and publicly describe some of the worst moments of their own lives, in service of a case that, despite all that renewed attention, has never actually reached a resolution capable of giving them genuine closure. Hartnell, who survived the September 1969 Lake Berryessa stabbing that killed his companion Cecilia Shepard, has spoken publicly on multiple occasions over the decades about the strange, uncomfortable position of being one of the few living people who directly encountered the killer face to face, fielding endless questions and amateur theories from researchers hoping his first-hand account might somehow unlock a detail investigators had missed, while never actually being able to offer the one piece of information everyone ultimately wants from him: a definitive name. That dynamic, genuine survivors of documented violence being repeatedly, indefinitely drawn back into public discussion of their own trauma by a case that simply refuses to close, is worth remembering whenever the Zodiac case gets discussed primarily through the lens of its puzzles and ciphers. Since underneath the codes and the decades of amateur theorizing sit real people who lived through, and in some cases survived, genuinely violent attacks that have never received the legal resolution most victims of violent crime are eventually able to count on. More than 55 years after the last confirmed attack, the Zodiac case remains formally classified as open by both the FBI and every California law enforcement agency that has ever handled it. A genuinely rare status for a case this old. Most decades-old unsolved homicides eventually get administratively deprioritized even if never technically closed, and it's a status that continues to draw fresh resources specifically because of how much of the original physical evidence, however degraded, has actually survived intact, giving investigators a genuine, if difficult, technical path toward eventual resolution that considerably older or more poorly preserved cases from the same general era simply don't have available to them anymore. Sometime between midnight and dawn on June 10, 1912, someone entered a modest wood-frame house in the small farming town of Villisca, Iowa, and killed 8 people with an axe, 6 of them children, without a single neighbor on the quiet residential street reporting having heard anything at all. The killer covered every mirror in the house, left the murder weapon behind, and vanished. Investigators pursued suspects for years. One man was tried twice, and to this day, more than a century later, nobody has ever been definitively convicted. This is the real story of the Villisca axe murders, one of the most thoroughly documented and most genuinely unresolved mass murder cases in American history. Villisca in 1912 was a small, unremarkable farming community in southwestern Iowa. The kind of place where a family like the Moores, prosperous, well-liked, and active in the local Presbyterian church, represented exactly the sort of stable, respectable household few residents would have imagined, becoming the target of extreme violence. Josiah Moore ran a successful farm implement business in town, and he and his wife Sarah were raising 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, ranging in age from 11 down to 5. On the night of the murders, the Moore children had 2 overnight guests, sisters Lena and Ina Stillinger, aged 12 and 8, friends of the Moore children who were staying over after attending a church event earlier that evening. A completely ordinary, unremarkable childhood sleepover that, placed both girls in the house at exactly the wrong moment in history. The family failed to appear the following morning, unusual enough for the reliably punctual Moores that a concerned neighbour, Mary Peckham, went to check on the household around 7 that morning. Finding the doors locked and getting no response, she eventually alerted Josiah's brother, who arrived with a key and discovered the horror inside. All 8 occupants of the house had been bludgeoned to death with an axe while apparently asleep in their beds. The attacks carried out with an intensity that shocked even experienced investigators who arrived at the scene afterward. Josiah Moore had sustained the most severe injuries of any victim. His face struck so many times that his features were no longer clearly recognizable, and his eyes, according to the original coroner's report, had effectively been destroyed by the blows, a detail investigators at the time interpreted as evidence of either overwhelming rage directed specifically at him, or a killer making absolutely certain he could not identify his attacker even in his final moments. Every other victim in the house, Sarah Moore, all 4 Moore children, and both Stillinger sisters, had also been killed with repeated axe blows to the head while in their beds, with medical examiners at the time noting the attacks appeared to have occurred while each victim was still asleep, suggesting the killer moved from room to room with disturbing speed, precision, and control. The crime scene itself contained a series of specific, deliberate details that have puzzled investigators and researchers for more than a century, precisely because they suggest a killer operating with a level of calm, methodical purpose that sits uncomfortably alongside the sheer physical brutality of the attacks themselves. Every mirror in the house had been covered, with clothing or cloth items deliberately draped over each one, a detail some later researchers have connected to broader folk superstitions of the era regarding mirrors and death, though no conclusive explanation for the killer's specific motive in doing so has ever been established. A pan of bloody water was found sitting in the kitchen, suggesting the killer had paused at some point during or after the murders to wash, possibly cleaning the axe itself or their own hands, before continuing through the house or eventually leaving. A slab of uneaten bacon was found on the kitchen counter alongside a plate, suggesting the killer may have stopped to eat inside the house at some point during the night, a detail that, when it became publicly known, added an entirely new, deeply unsettling layer to the case's already disturbing profile of whoever was responsible. The axe used in the killings, which belonged to the Moore family itself, was found leaning against a wall inside one of the bedrooms, left behind entirely rather than taken from the scene. And perhaps most chillingly of all for investigators trying to establish a timeline, all the window blinds throughout the house had been drawn, and the family's own kerosene lamp had apparently been used by the killer to see by during the attacks, then left, its chimney removed and placed carefully at the foot of a bed rather than being shattered, extinguished carelessly or taken away. The initial crime scene investigation was, by virtually every modern standard, catastrophically compromised, and that failure is itself a significant, well-documented part of why the case has never been conclusively solved. Word of the murders spread through the small town almost immediately, and rather than securing the property, local officials allowed a large number of townspeople, curious neighbours, local officials without any real forensic training, and eventually outright sightseers to walk freely through the house in the hours and days following the discovery, touching surfaces, moving items, and in the process almost certainly destroying or contaminating whatever physical evidence, fingerprints, footprints, or other trace material might otherwise have survived to be properly examined. Formal forensic techniques like fingerprint analysis, while technically available in a limited capacity by 1912, were not consistently or rigorously applied at the Villisca scene. And the absence of any centralized professional crime scene protocol at the local level in rural Iowa at the time meant that whatever the killer might have inadvertently left behind was very likely lost within the first 24 hours, long before any serious systematic investigation could even begin. Despite that badly compromised start, investigators pursued numerous leads and suspects over the following years, and several of those individual threads deserve to be understood on their own terms, since the case's ultimate lack of resolution wasn't for lack of genuine investigative effort. A state senator named Frank F. Jones became an early person of interest based on a documented business dispute and personal animosity with Josiah Moore, who had previously worked for Jones's farm implement company before leaving to start his own competing business, reportedly souring their relationship considerably in the years before the murders. Suspicion around Jones intensified when a man named William Mansfield later claimed, years afterward, that Jones had paid him to carry out the killings, though Mansfield's own credibility came under serious question given his own documented criminal history and inconsistencies in his account. And no formal charges were ever brought against either Jones or Mansfield in connection with the murders. Jones, a genuinely prominent local figure who had served in the Iowa state legislature, vigorously denied any involvement throughout the years he remained under public suspicion, and pursued his own defamation lawsuits against individuals and publications that publicly implicated him, a legal response that itself became a significant, protracted secondary saga running alongside the main murder investigation for years afterward. Investigators at the time were genuinely divided over how seriously to weigh the Jones theory, given that a documented business rivalry, however genuinely bitter, represented a considerably weaker and more circumstantial motive than investigators would typically expect to find behind an attack of this specific scale and brutality, killing an entire household of 8 people, including 6 children with no connection whatsoever to the underlying business dispute, rather than a more narrowly targeted act of violence against Josiah Moore alone. The Stillinger family's experience of the case adds a genuinely important, often underrepresented dimension to how the murders are remembered, since the 2 Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, were, in the strictest sense, entirely unconnected to whatever underlying motive, business rivalry, religious fixation, or itinerant predation actually drove the killer, present in the house purely because of an entirely ordinary childhood sleepover arrangement made with the Moore family days earlier. Their parents, who lived elsewhere in the surrounding county, were notified of their daughters' deaths only after investigators had already begun processing the scene, and later accounts from surviving Stillinger family descendants have described a grief compounded specifically by the senseless, arbitrary nature of their daughter's presence in the house that particular night, a detail that separates the Stillinger sisters' deaths from the broader Moore family tragedy in a genuinely distinct and in some ways even more unsettling way, had the sleepover simply been scheduled for a different night, or at a different friend's house instead. 2 young girls with no connection at all to whatever motive drove the killer would very likely have lived out entirely ordinary lives. The suspect who came closest to actual conviction was Reverend George Kelly. It's worth pausing on the sheer scale of what a town the size of Villisca, with a population of only around 2,500 people in 1912, actually experienced that week, because the murders didn't happen in isolation from the surrounding community the way a modern true crime retelling can sometimes make a century-old case feel. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters were buried in a single, enormous joint funeral held just days after the murders, drawing a crowd local newspapers at the time estimated in the thousands, an extraordinary turnout for a town of that size, reflecting both the Moores' genuine standing in the community and the sheer overwhelming shock the killings produced across the entire region. Local and regional newspapers covered the case with an intensity that quickly turned Villisca into a genuine national news story within days, drawing private detectives, self-proclaimed psychics, and amateur investigators to the small town from across the country, several of whom inserted themselves directly into the official investigation, with varying degrees of legitimacy and usefulness, further complicating an already badly compromised inquiry. The Iowa state government eventually became involved directly, assigning agents to assist the local investigation given the case's scale and the mounting public pressure for an arrest, though even that additional resource was ultimately unable to produce a conviction that would hold. The suspect who came closest to actual conviction was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister with a documented history of erratic behavior and past legal trouble involving inappropriate conduct toward children who had reportedly been in Villisca on the night of the murders and left town on an early train the following morning. Kelly became a serious suspect years after the murders, following a period during which he reportedly made statements to multiple people that investigators interpreted as suggestive of guilt, including comments made during psychiatric treatment. He underwent related to unrelated legal troubles. Kelly was tried twice for the Villisca murders. His first trial, held in 1917, ended in a hung jury unable to reach a unanimous verdict. His second trial in 1918 ended in a full acquittal, with jurors reportedly troubled by the lack of any physical evidence directly connecting Kelly to the crime scene, and by serious doubts about the reliability of a confession-like statement prosecutors presented that Kelly had, at various points, both made and recanted under what his defense argued were psychologically coercive circumstances. Kelly was never convicted, and he lived the remainder of his life maintaining his innocence, dying in the 1960s without the case ever being formally resolved against him or anyone else. More recent research into the case has connected it, at least as a plausible theory rather than a settled conclusion, to a considerably broader pattern some historians have proposed linking numerous unsolved axe murders of entire sleeping families across small American towns roughly between 1898 and 1912. The same general period and modus operandi, sleeping victims, an axe belonging to the household itself used as the weapon, and attacks occurring in towns located near active rail lines. Authors Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James laid out this theory in extensive detail in their 2017 book, Examining the Pattern, arguing that a single itinerant killer traveling by train between towns and selecting isolated, vulnerable households near each stop may have been responsible for a considerably larger number of connected killings across multiple states than had previously been recognized as related, with Villisca representing, in their analysis, one of the most extensively documented and most likely genuinely connected cases within that broader theorized pattern. The theory remains actively debated among historians and true crime researchers, has never been formally adopted by any law enforcement agency as an official resolution to the Villisca case specifically, and the identity of any single traveling killer responsible for that broader theorized pattern has never been conclusively established either, meaning that even the most serious modern scholarly attempt to explain the case still ultimately arrives at another name without definitive proof attached to it. That name, in James and McCarthy James's specific research, is Paul Muller, a German immigrant who arrived in the United States in 1890, described in contemporary records the authors uncovered as a short, powerfully built man who reportedly bore multiple tattoos depicting axes on his own body, a detail that, if accurate, adds a genuinely disturbing layer to an already unsettling theory. The authors traced documented movements connecting Muller to the general vicinity of several of the other murders they identified as part of the same broader pattern, along with circumstantial testimony from contemporaries describing him as having expressed unusual, troubling fixations, though. Exactly as with every other suspect examined across more than a century of investigation into the Villisca murders, specifically, no direct physical evidence has ever been recovered definitively, placing Muller inside the Moore house on the night of June 9, 1912. Crime historian and author Harold Schechter, reviewing James and McCarthy James's research independently, has stated publicly that he considers the man from the train theory the most credible explanation yet proposed for the Villisca killing specifically, a genuinely significant endorsement from a serious researcher in the field, though most credible proposed explanation and definitively solved case remain two meaningfully different things, and the Villisca murders remain, in the strict official sense, exactly as unsolved today as they were the morning Mary Peckham first walked next door to check on a family that hadn't answered its phone or opened its curtains. The house itself still stands in Villisca today, restored and operated as a genuine historic site, purchased in the 1990s by private owners, specifically committed to preserving the property in a condition closely matching its original 1912 layout and furnishings, based on period photographs, coroner's reports, and surviving family records. It's open to the public for both daytime historical tours and, considerably more controversially, overnight paranormal investigation stays, marketed specifically to ghost hunting enthusiasts drawn by the site's dark history, a business model that has generated real, ongoing debate among true crime researchers, local historians, and some remaining descendants of the extended Moore and Stillinger families about where legitimate historical preservation ends and exploitative dark tourism begins. Supporters of the current arrangement argue that the site's operation is what has kept the house standing, and the case's historical record actively researched and preserved at all, funding ongoing archival work through tourism revenue that a case this old would otherwise struggle to attract. Critics argue that turning the actual bedroom where 6 children were murdered into an overnight ghost hunting attraction sits uncomfortably close to treating a real, still fundamentally unresolved tragedy as entertainment. Both perspectives have real merit, and the tension between them is, in its own right, a genuinely useful lens for thinking about how the broader true crime genre handles cases this old, where every living person with a direct personal connection to the victims has long since passed away. But the moral weight of the original tragedy hasn't actually diminished just because the calendar has moved a century forward. Modern cold case researchers, including the volunteer-run organization Iowa Cold Cases, have continued actively cataloging and re-examining the surviving Villisca case file in recent years, cross-referencing period newspaper archives, court transcripts from both of George Kelly's trials, and correspondence connected to the various named suspects investigated over the decades, though without access to any surviving physical evidence suitable for modern forensic testing. Given how thoroughly the original crime scene was compromised in 1912, and how little physical evidence appears to have survived in any preserved testable form in the 11 decades since, that absence of testable physical evidence is, in the end, the case's single most defining and most permanent obstacle. Unlike several other unsolved American murder cases from the same general era, where preserved letters, envelopes, or clothing have occasionally yielded viable genetic material for modern DNA analysis decades after the fact, Villisca offers researchers essentially nothing comparable to work with, which means that, barring some currently unknown piece of period evidence surfacing from a private collection or forgotten archive somewhere, the Villisca axe murders will very likely remain exactly what they've been for the past 113 years. One of America's most extensively theorized, most exhaustively researched, and still, ultimately, entirely unsolved mass murders. The broader man-from-the-train theory, whatever its ultimate merits regarding Paul Muller specifically, has had one clearly positive, well-documented effect on the historical record surrounding cases like Villisca, entirely apart from whether it's ever formally accepted as the definitive solution. It prompted a genuinely enormous, systematic redigitization and cross-referencing effort across regional newspaper archives throughout the rural United States, work James and McCarthy James undertook specifically to test their theory, but that has since become a broadly useful historical resource for researchers studying early 20th century rural crime more generally, independent of the specific killer theory it was originally compiled to support. That kind of comprehensive archival cross-referencing simply didn't exist in any centralized, searchable form before their research project, meaning that even researchers who remain unconvinced by the Mueller theory specifically have generally credited the broader project with meaningfully advancing the field's understanding of how frequently and how similarly family-targeted axe murders actually occurred across small American towns during this specific window in the country's history, a pattern that, whether or not it was ultimately the work of one single traveling killer, does appear to represent a genuine, previously under-recognized cluster of similar rural violence rather than a series of entirely isolated, coincidentally similar tragedies. The specific vulnerability of rural turn-of-the-century American law enforcement infrastructure deserves its own direct explanation too, since it's central to understanding why a case this violent, occurring in a country that already had functioning municipal police departments and even some early forensic capability in its larger cities, could still go so thoroughly, permanently unsolved. Villisca in 1912, like thousands of comparably sized American towns at the time, had no dedicated professional police detective force of its own, relying instead on a small number of local constables and sheriff's deputies with essentially no specialized homicide investigation training, no access to formal forensic laboratories, and no established protocol for securing and preserving a crime scene against exactly the kind of public contamination that occurred within hours of the Moore family's bodies being discovered. Serious cases requiring more specialized investigative resources typically depended on state-level assistance, which, even when genuinely well-intentioned, as it was in Valiska's case, still meant investigators arriving days after the crime scene had already been thoroughly compromised by well-meaning but untrained local residents and officials. The structural gap in early 20th century rural American law enforcement capacity is a recurring, well-documented factor across numerous unsolved crimes from the same general era, and it's precisely the kind of systemic vulnerability that theories like the man from the train have argued. Ayud, mobile, itinerant killer, could have specifically, deliberately exploited, deliberately selecting small, isolated rural towns near rail lines, specifically because they offered significantly less investigative capability and cross-jurisdictional coordination than a similar attack would have. Encountered in a major city. In the weeks before 6 people were murdered on an isolated farm in Bavaria in 1922, the farm's owner told neighbors about footprints in the snow leading from the surrounding forest directly to his farmhouse, with no footprints ever leading back out. He found a newspaper on the property he didn't remember buying. He heard footsteps in the attic at night. He mentioned all of this to people in the nearby village in the days before he, his wife, his widowed daughter, her 2 young children, and the family's maid were all killed with a mattock, a farm tool used for digging, inside their own home. The killer then reportedly stayed on the property for several additional days afterward, feeding the family's livestock, before disappearing entirely. More than a century later, despite modern forensic re-examination, the case remains completely unsolved. This is the real story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, widely considered Germany's most notorious unsolved crime. Hinterkaifeck was a small, isolated farmstead located roughly 40 miles north of Munich in the Bavarian countryside, deliberately positioned in a genuinely remote spot even by the standards of rural farms in the region, set back from the nearest road and surrounded by forest on multiple sides, with the closest neighbouring village, Wangen, requiring a walk of roughly a mile along an unpaved path to reach. The farm was owned and worked by Andreas Gruber, 63 years old at the time of the murders, along with his wife Cecilia, 72. Living with them was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, and her 2 young children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. A new maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44, had only just arrived to begin working on the farm on the very day of the murders, replacing a previous maid who had abruptly quit the position roughly 6 months earlier, reportedly after telling acquaintances in the village that she had heard unexplained footsteps and other unsettling sounds coming from the house's attic space, and had grown to believe the property was haunted, a detail that, whatever its actual supernatural merit, is well documented in surviving witness statements gathered by investigators after the murders. In the weeks leading up to the killings, Andreas Gruber reported a series of specifically unsettling occurrences to multiple people in the nearby village, testimony investigators later took seriously precisely because it came from several independent witnesses who separately recalled Gruber describing the same events around the same time, rather than being a single uncorroborated account. Gruber told acquaintances he had discovered a set of footprints in freshly fallen snow, leading from the edge of the nearby forest directly to the farmhouse without any corresponding footprints, leading back away from the property, suggesting to him that someone had approached the house and either remained on the grounds or entered the building itself. He also reported finding a Munich newspaper on the property that neither he nor any other member of the household recalled purchasing or bringing home, an object that, in a household this remote and this routine-bound, stood out as genuinely anomalous. And in the days immediately before the murders, Gruber told at least one neighbor he had heard footsteps in the attic at night, despite there being no reason for anyone, family member or otherwise, to be up there at that hour. A report he connected, at least in his own telling, to the same unexplained sense of being watched or intruded upon that the earlier missing maid had also described months before quitting. The murders themselves are understood to have occurred on the evening of March 31, 1922. Based on the specific state of decomposition and other physical evidence investigators documented when the bodies were eventually discovered several days later, since no one from the isolated farm had been seen in the village for a suspiciously extended period, prompting a group of concerned neighbors to finally walk out to check on the family on April 4th. What they found was catastrophic. All 6 residents of the farm, Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria, both grandchildren, and the newly arrived maid Maria Baumgartner, had been killed with the same weapon, a mattock, a heavy farm tool resembling a pickaxe typically used for breaking up soil, which investigators eventually recovered hidden in the property's barn loft. 4 of the 6 victims, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and the maid, were found in the barn itself, apparently lured or led there individually before being killed, one at a time, in a pattern investigators interpreted as evidence of a methodical, controlled approach rather than a single chaotic outburst of violence. The 2 youngest victims, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, were found inside the farmhouse itself, in circumstances that suggested to investigators at the time that young Cecilia may have survived the initial attack on the rest of her family for some period, based on documented evidence at the scene that she had visibly pulled out portions of her own hair in what examiners believed represented a documented physical response to extreme shock or distress, a detail that has remained one of the case's most genuinely difficult to process for anyone who has studied the file closely in the centuries since. What makes the case even more disturbing than the killings themselves is the physical evidence investigators found suggesting the killer, or killers, didn't leave the property immediately after the murders, but rather remained on the isolated farm for some additional period afterward, a detail almost without precedent in the broader history of documented unsolved murder cases. The farmhouse showed clear signs that someone had continued living there in the days following the killings. Food had been prepared and consumed in the kitchen after the murders had occurred, based on the state and freshness of items found there. A fire had been kept burning in the stove, and, most strikingly, the farm's livestock, cattle that would otherwise have gone unfed, and shown clear signs of distress or neglect within a day or 2, were found alive and in reasonable condition, strongly suggesting someone had continued feeding and tending to the animals for several days after killing every human occupant of the property. Neighbors in the surrounding area later recalled seeing smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney on multiple days following what investigators eventually determined to be the actual date of the murders. And at least one witness reported seeing what appeared to be a person moving around the property. During that window, details that, taken together, paint an almost incomprehensibly calculated picture. Whoever committed the murders apparently felt secure enough in the property's genuine isolation to simply continue living there, tending the farm's animals, cooking meals, and keeping warm for several days before finally leaving for good. The initial police investigation, like several other rural mass murder cases from this general era, investigated with the comparatively limited forensic tools available in the early 1920s, was hampered by significant crime scene contamination, since word of the discovery spread through the surrounding villages quickly, and, similar to other cases of this kind, curious neighbors and even some early investigators reportedly moved through portions of the property before it could be properly systematically documented and secured, an issue compounded by the case falling under Bavarian rural jurisdiction with considerably fewer trained forensic resources available than would have been the case in a major city like Munich itself. Investigators pursued numerous leads and suspects over the following years without ever developing sufficient evidence to bring formal charges against anyone. Suspicion fell, at various points, on Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband and the father of at least the younger of her 2 children, who had reportedly been officially declared dead during his military service in the First World War, though some investigators and researchers have questioned whether Gabriel might have actually survived the war and secretly returned, motivated by some combination of jealousy, resentment over Victoria's documented affair with a neighbouring farmer during his presumed absence, or disputes over paternity, given persistent local rumours, never conclusively proven. That young Joseph might actually have been fathered by Victoria's own father, Andreas Gruber, a genuinely disturbing theory that has circulated in various forms among researchers examining the case for decades without ever being definitively confirmed or ruled out. Other theories investigators and later researchers have proposed over the following century range from a specific named neighboring farmer, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who had reportedly fathered Victoria's younger child and who behaved, according to some witness accounts, in ways investigators at the time found suspicious around the discovery of the bodies, including reportedly moving items at the crime scene before officials arrived, to more general theories involving an unidentified vagrant or itinerant laborer passing through the area, drawn by the farm's genuine isolation, and perhaps motivated by robbery, though nothing of significant value was reported missing from the property, which has led most serious researchers to treat a straightforward robbery motive with real skepticism. Schlittenbauer himself was investigated multiple times over subsequent decades, including a formal reopening of suspicion against him decades later, and was never charged, maintaining his innocence until his own death. In 2007, instructors and students at the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy in Bavaria took on the Hinterkaifeck case as a formal training exercise, applying modern criminal investigation methodology, victimology, and evidence analysis techniques to the surviving century-old case file, treating it essentially as a live cold case review despite its considerable age, using surviving witness statements, court records, and case documentation that had, remarkably for a rural case this old, been preserved in reasonably complete form in regional Bavarian archives. The Academy's review reportedly concluded that investigators had identified a specific individual they considered the most likely suspect based on the full body of surviving circumstantial evidence, though the Academy made the deliberate decision not to publicly release that individual's name, citing respect and sensitivity toward any living descendants or relatives who might still be connected to whoever the identified individual actually was. Despite reaching that internal conclusion about a most likely suspect, the Academy's official published findings were considerably more cautious and definitive in the opposite direction on the broader question of resolution, ultimately concluding that the case, as a matter of formal, provable criminal justice rather than informed historical speculation, could not actually be solved using the surviving evidence, however strongly circumstantial suspicion might point toward any single individual. The fate of the physical evidence itself is its own genuinely strange coda to the case. Following the original 1922 investigation, the victims' skulls were removed by the examining court physician and sent to Munich for further medical and investigative examination, a reasonably standard forensic practice for the era. In a detail that says a great deal about the state of criminal investigation methodology in 1920s Bavaria and about how genuinely desperate authorities had become for any lead at all, the skulls were, at some point during this process, also given to psychics and self-described clairvoyants, who were asked to attempt to divine information about the killer's identity from the remains. An investigative approach that obviously produced nothing of evidentiary value, but that remains a genuinely telling illustration of just how thoroughly conventional investigative methods had already been exhausted within just a few years of the murders. The skulls were subsequently lost entirely during the chaos of the Second World War, meaning that even if modern forensic and DNA analysis techniques were applied to the case today, the single most directly relevant piece of physical evidence, the victim's own remains, no longer exists to be tested at all, a loss that considerably narrows what modern forensic science could realistically still contribute to the case, even under the most optimistic circumstances. The physical farmhouse itself no longer exists at all, a decision the surrounding community reached remarkably quickly, given how recently the murders had occurred. In 1923, just a year after the killings, the original farmhouse was deliberately demolished, reportedly reflecting a genuine reluctance among people in the surrounding villages to see the building continue standing, given both its horrific recent history and, according to some contemporary accounts, a genuine local unease bordering on superstition about the property itself following the earlier reports of unexplained footsteps and the maid's own documented fear that the house was haunted even before the murders occurred. A small, simple memorial, a modest stone or concrete marker bearing the names of the 6 victims, was erected near the original farm site not long afterward, and it remains there today, drawing a steady trickle of visitors, historians, and true crime researchers from across Germany and increasingly from abroad, even though nothing of the original structure itself survives to be viewed or toured, a meaningfully different situation from several comparable American cases of the same general era, where the original murder houses have, for better or worse, often been preserved, restored, or converted into tourist attractions rather than deliberately erased entirely. It's worth spending a moment specifically on Maria Baumgartner, the family's newly arrived maid, since her position within the case's broader narrative has often been comparatively overlooked relative to the Gruber family itself, despite her death representing just as senseless and arbitrary a loss as the Stillinger sisters' deaths in the roughly contemporaneous Valiska case half a world away. Baumgartner had arrived at Hinterkaifeck to begin her employment on the very day of the murders, meaning she had spent, at most, only a handful of hours as part of the household before being killed alongside the family she'd just started working for, having had no meaningful opportunity to become entangled in whatever underlying family tension, paternity dispute, or outside grievance actually motivated the killings. Some researchers examining the case have specifically noted that Baumgartner's death is one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence against theories centered narrowly on family internal motives, reasoning that a killer motivated purely by a specific grievance against Andreas Gruber, Victoria, or her children would have had comparatively little practical reason to also kill a maid who had been on the property for only a few hours and who, by definition, could not yet have been meaningfully entangled in whatever conflict actually drove the attack, a detail that has kept the outside intruder and returning husband theories both genuinely alive in ongoing discussion of the case, since both scenarios more easily accommodate the maid's presence being simple, tragic, coincidental timing rather than a specifically targeted decision. The rumoured affair between Victoria Gabriel and neighbouring farmer Lorenz Schlittenbauer, and the associated persistent suspicion that Schlittenbauer, rather than Victoria's absent or possibly deceased husband Karl Gabriel, was the biological father of young Joseph, has remained one of the case's most actively debated threats precisely because it offers a considerably more psychologically coherent motive than the alternative theories on offer. A jealous, humiliated returning husband, discovering evidence of his wife's affair and a child that might not be his own, represents in the eyes of many researchers who've studied the case closely, a more emotionally legible motive for this specific level of violence, directed at the entire household rather than a single individual, than either a random itinerant attacker with no personal connection to the family, or a neighbouring farmer like Schlittenbauer, who, whatever his own documented behaviour at the crime scene and however suspicious investigators found him at various points, would have had a comparatively harder time explaining why he'd need to kill his own child if Joseph truly was his son, along with the rest of the household, purely to conceal an affair local gossip already seemed to know about anyway. Neither theory has ever been proven, and it's genuinely possible, as some researchers examining the case have argued, that the full truth involves some combination of factors investigators in 1922, working with the forensic and investigative tools available to them at the time, simply weren't equipped to fully untangle. More than a century on, the Hinterkaifeck murders occupy a genuinely distinct place within the broader landscape of unsolved historical crime, precisely because of how many individually strange, difficult to explain details accumulated around a single case that, stripped of any of them, would already qualify as one of the more disturbing family massacres of the early 20th century on its violence alone. The footprints leading toward the house with none leading away. The unexplained newspaper. The footsteps in the attic reported by two separate people months apart. The killer who didn't flee but stayed, fed the livestock, cooked meals, and kept the fire burning for days before finally disappearing for good. A young girl who appeared, based on physical evidence at the scene, to have survived long enough to grasp at least something of what was happening to her family around her. Any one of these details on its own would be enough to make a case memorable. Stacked together, inside a single documented file investigators have now spent more than 100 years poring over, they've made Hinterkaifeck something closer to a permanent fixture of European true crime, regularly cited by researchers, criminologists, and documentary filmmakers, not just in Germany, but internationally as one of the clearest examples of a case where the sheer accumulated weight of unsettling circumstantial detail has never once translated into an actual, provable name. That gap between overwhelming atmosphere and an entirely absent conclusion is, in the end, exactly what continues drawing new researchers back to the case more than a century later. Modern criminologists, studying Hinterkaifeck as a formal case study, including the Furstenfeldbruck Academy's own 2007 training exercise, have generally agreed the surviving evidence points meaningfully towards someone the family already knew, rather than a random stranger passing through, based on the apparent ease with which the killer moved victims individually to the barn, the intimate knowledge required to know exactly where farm tools like the mattock were kept, and the sheer, sustained comfort of remaining on an isolated, but still occasionally visited property for days afterward without any apparent fear of discovery, but knowing, with reasonable confidence, that the killer was very likely someone connected to the family's own small social world rather than an anonymous outsider, has never actually been enough to produce a name that could survive real legal scrutiny, and with the physical evidence lost to time and war, and every person who might have had direct first-hand knowledge of that night long since dead themselves, the Hinterkaifeck murders will, in all likelihood, remain exactly what they've been since April 1922, Germany's most thoroughly examined and most permanently unsolved crime. The case's place in German popular culture specifically is worth understanding too, since Hinterkaifeck occupies a role in German true crime storytelling roughly comparable to how cases like the Black Dahlia or the Zodiac Killer function within American popular culture, are genuinely foundational. Oft-referenced touchstone that numerous books, television documentaries and, more recently, podcast series have continued returning to across the decades, each new retelling generally working from the same limited, well-preserved, but ultimately finite body of original 1922 investigative material. A number of German-language novels and at least one feature film have used the case as direct inspiration over the years. And regional historical societies in Bavaria have continued actively maintaining and occasionally updating the small memorial near the original farm site, treating ongoing public interest in the case as, on balance, a legitimate opportunity for historical education about rural Bavarian life in the early 20th century, rather than something to be actively discouraged, a considerably different community posture than the more openly commercialized dark tourism approach some comparable American murder sites have adopted. That distinction, a preserved memorial rather than a preserved monetized crime scene, reflects broader differences in how different cultures have chosen to handle the physical remnants of historical unsolved violence, and it's part of why visiting the Hinterkaifeck site today offers a noticeably quieter, more contemplative experience than touring an actively operating true crime tourist attraction elsewhere in the world. Comparing Hinterkaifeck directly against Villisca, a case that occurred in a broadly similar rural farming setting just a decade earlier on the opposite side of the Atlantic, offers a genuinely useful lens for understanding how much basic investigative infrastructure, or the lack of it, shapes whether a case this violent ultimately gets solved. Both cases involved entire households, including multiple children, killed with a blunt farm implement while asleep, in isolated rural properties with no immediate neighbors close enough to hear anything unusual, investigated by local law enforcement with minimal specialized homicide training and no meaningful forensic laboratory support, and both cases were further compromised by crowds of untrained local residents moving through the crime scene before it could be properly secured. Neither case has ever been solved, more than a century later, despite each generating extensive contemporary investigation, numerous named suspects, and, in more recent decades, dedicated modern research efforts specifically revisiting the original evidence with contemporary investigative methodology. Taken together, cases like Hinterkaifeck and Villisca illustrate something true crime retellings focus purely on the individual strangeness of each case can sometimes obscure that the specific historical moment and geographic setting in which a crime occurs, decades before centralized forensic science, DNA analysis, or coordinated interjurisdictional law enforcement infrastructure existed in any meaningfully reliable form, may ultimately matter just as much to whether a case gets solved as anything about the crime itself or the killer's own specific choices and mistakes.